Is it okay to get married and intentionally not have kids? Is contraception permissible or not? How might Catholics and Protestants agree and disagree on some of the most sensitive, timely, and commonly asked questions today about sex and marriage? We've got two guests today who I deeply respect, have benefited from their work profoundly. Can't wait for you to hear from them. But first off, if you haven't noticed, this is going to be a mature conversation. If you have kids in the room, I would encourage you to hit pause, listen to this first, and then come back. Because to be honest with you, we're going to talk about some of the issues I get asked a lot, and I know both of my guests do as well. Things like, how might a Christian think about masturbation, oral sex, sex manuals, contraception? These are real questions, and the Bible and the Christian faith speaks to them. My first guest, Dr. Christopher West, is perhaps most well known for his work on the theology of the body. He's a Catholic scholar and has popularized the work of John Paul II, which has deeply, I told you, Dr. West, influenced my own thinking on this. Even though I'm a Protestant, it has been revolutionary for me, is the only way I can describe your work. Grateful for you to come back a second time. Scott Ray is my co-host for the Think Biblically podcast. Full disclosure, we are colleagues together at Biola, but my job today is to facilitate a conversation, not a debate, where Catholics and Protestants agree and where they differ. So let's dive in. Both of you, thanks for joining us today.
It's a great joy to be with you, Sean, and with you, Scott.
Yeah, my pleasure. Christopher, it's good to make your acquaintance. Appreciated reading your stuff.
I'm so glad. Thank you, brother.
Well, I'm going to go to you first, Christopher, and maybe you could just lay out for us, what is unique about a Catholic view of sex and marriage?
I think we'd have to zoom in on the word sacrament to recognize what's distinctly Catholic and where Protestant and Catholic understanding of marriage differ. When the Catholic Church says that marriage is a sacrament, we're saying that it's not only a symbol of Christ's love for the church. I mean, Protestants and Catholics would agree on that the marriage of a man and a woman, the love of a man and woman in their marital love, they are a symbol of Christ's love for the church. But when the Catholic Church says it's a sacrament, it's saying that that symbol efficaciously, that's the technical word, which means really and effectively communicates the love of Christ in the church. For example, why is divorce not only is it, the Catholic Church would not say divorce is wrong. The Catholic Church would say divorce is impossible.
Hmm.
If a couple is validly married, that's another discussion. It is impossible for them not to be married. Why? Because it really communicates the love of Christ in the church, and it is impossible for Christ to abandon his church. That's how seriously Catholics take the idea of marriage being a sacrament. Everything the Catholic Church teaches about marital love, sexual union, sexual morality has to do with, does this really and truly communicate the love of Christ in the church, or does it not? That's the paradigm for understanding everything.
Scott, how might Protestants agree and or disagree with that approach to sex and marriage?
Well, I think most Protestants would agree. I think that there's something special about marriage in that it models the relationship between Christ and the church. I think Ephesians 5, 22 to 35 is pretty clear about that. I don't think Protestants would be inclined to call it a sacrament. However, I think Protestants generally see the two sacraments that the Scripture lays out really clearly as being believers' baptism and the Lord's Supper, as being the only two things that would qualify as a sacrament. So I think we would agree that marriage has a gravitas to it, and that it communicates something important. It models the relationship between Christ and the church. I think Protestants would also take issue with the fact that divorce is impossible. Though I see where that follows from the notion of marriage being a sacrament. Protestants mostly look to the teaching of Jesus and the teaching of Paul that make allowances for divorce under certain circumstances, sort of in keeping with what was designed during Old Testament law. So I think there, when in the question whether remarriage is allowed after a legitimate divorce, I think that's a different matter, and there's I think a lot of room for debate among Protestants about that. More recently, our friend and colleague Wayne Grudem has suggested that there might be some other grounds for divorce that would be biblically valid, but that's probably a discussion that goes beyond our time here.
Maybe I could clarify something, Sean and Scott, that when I say the Catholic Church doesn't so much say divorce is wrong, but that it's impossible, that does not mean that the Catholic Church does not recognize there are circumstances in which separation of bed and board are necessary, right? And the Catholic Church would also understand that a divorce certificate filed with the local court might be necessary for the protection of one of the parties. But that would not change the mind of the church that there is still a valid marriage in the eyes of God, and what God has joined, we cannot separate.
That's helpful, just in terms of a distinction between the Catholic Protestant approach. You've both written on body. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think Protestants would, I think, say that when Jesus talked about sexual immorality being a basis for divorce, that does separate the previous one flesh relationship in a meaningful way. So I think that would be, I think, a difference. And I think though we would agree on what the civil law would mandate as being separate from bed and board, I think as Protestants understand the teaching of Jesus, they would no longer be married in that sense.
Okay. Fair enough. That's good. That's a good distinction. One more kind of 30,000-foot view question, then we're going to jump into some of the particulars. You both have written on kind of questions of body and the soul. Dr. West, you've written a theology of the body. Scott, Dr. Ray, you've written a book called Body and Soul. So I'd be curious, maybe we could start with you, Christopher. What is a Catholic view of what makes us human in terms of body and soul? And how does this inform what the Catholic Church teaches about sex and marriage?
Yeah, this is the critical question, I think, facing the church in the modern world. We are getting these moral questions wrong because we don't have a proper relationship of the body and the soul. And let me just clarify one thing. When we speak of the theology of the body in the Catholic Church, I didn't write it. I'm a commentator on St. John Paul II's theology of the body. I could never take credit for writing the theology of the body. That came from Pope John Paul II. But let me press into this. John Paul II, in his theology of the body, says this is the central question of Christian anthropology. What is the relationship of body and soul? And the biblical view is very clear that the human being is a unity of body and soul. We are not a soul trapped in a body. The body is not a shell in which the real person dwells, right? St. Thomas Aquinas said that the soul is not me, right? We have this idea that the real me is the spiritual part and I'm kind of housed in a body. No, the real me, the real human identity of my person is the unity of body and soul. And we actually have a word to describe the separation of body and soul. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's called death. Christ came into the world to give us life and life to the full, which, if we have a proper biblical view of the human person, necessitates the reunion of the body and the soul. So what the original disciples of Jesus did 2,000 years ago that changed the world is they went around preaching the resurrection of the body, right? Every religion in one way or another believes in a kind of afterlife, but 99% of the time, that's a merely spiritual afterlife, right? The soul goes on, the body goes into the ground, it returns to dust. But the biblical view is that if God can gather dust together at the beginning of time and breathe his life into it, then he can gather that dust at the end of time and breathe his life into it again. And so we profess belief in the resurrection of the body, because that's what a human being is, a unity of body and soul.
Scott, your thoughts?
Um, yeah, I think I would certainly agree that the most pressing
Hmm.
moral and intellectual issue of our culture today is what constitutes a human person, and particularly who's included in that designation. Because if you get that wrong, then you've lost everything.
Hmm.
And I think in the culture, our culture today, we've gotten that wrong, which is why abortion is the way it is, and assisted suicide is on the rise. And we're looking at producing designer children and choosing the sex of our child. All these kinds of things. So I heartily affirm that our both our philosophical and our theological view of what constitutes a human person, and and as I would take it, who's included under that
Yeah.
umbrella of who counts as a person is that's the entailment of that logically follows that you have to get both of those right.
Hmm.
Yes.
And I think Protestants I think do borrow quite a bit from Thomas Aquinas on this. We find Thomas very helpful in establishing a connection between body and soul that's missing, I think, from the old traditional Cartesian view
Yes.
of body and soul. And so we find we would hold to what philosophers would call a Thomistic substance dualist
Hmm.
view of body and soul, where there's dynamic interaction at all times between body and soul, and that, in fact, we would suggest most of the capacities of our soul are incapable of being actualized or materialized without bodies. Because how else do you know if the capacities of your immaterial soul are actually coming to fruition unless they come to fruition in a material body? And I think and I would also agree that we will spend the lion's share of eternity with resurrected bodies, and which is really good news for
Hmm.
folks like me who have broken down shoulders and played way too many sports in our youth. And it's also very good news, I think, for people who are born with genetic abnormalities, who have various kinds
Hmm.
of disabilities. As I read the New Testament, all of our diseases will be healed when we have resurrected bodies. I've heard some Protestants, there's disagreement a bit on this, but some Protestants actually think that, for example, kids with Down syndrome will go into the eternal state also with Down syndrome.
Hmm.
That will not be resurrected. Because the argument they make is that if they were without Down syndrome, they'd be a different person. And I think, well, then if that's true, then what actually grounds our identity as a person? It can't be these certain what we would call accidental qualities that either get actualized or not.
Right.
It has to be something much deeper than that. And so I've pushed back with many of my Protestant colleagues who hold what I think is an incomplete view of what the resurrection body will look like. And so I think that the resurrection body, I think, is entirely good news
Hmm.
Yes.
for the follower of Christ in eternity. Now, where we might part company, and I don't know because you haven't spelled this out yet, is as most Protestants, I think, read the New Testament, they recognize that there's a period of time between a person's death and the Lord's return. And it's at the Lord's return where we will all have fully resurrected bodies to last us into the remainder of eternity. Uh, and so for a time, we will exist with the Lord in a disembodied state, awaiting the future final resurrection of Jesus that Paul describes in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15. I think that makes sense, at least Protestants take that makes sense out of Paul's statement in 2 Corinthians that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord.
Right.
So that I think it opens up the possibility of for lack of a better term, a temporary disembodied state where we will exist with the Lord, but awaiting a resurrection body
Hmm.
when Christ returns.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's very much the Catholic position as well. We,
Hmm.
the words like time are difficult words to use when we're talking about the other world, right? But yes, our language is limited here. But yes, Thomas Aquinas said the souls in heaven are currently in an inhuman state, awaiting the resurrection of their bodies at the end of time. So yes, there is some reality of separation of body and soul until the end of time when Christ returns. We would be in agreement on that.
Good.
Yeah, I
Find
think
some.
I think we would both agree that Thomas Aquinas got it right
Yep.
on that.
Agreed. Agreed.
Good. We'll take it. On that note, let's move to kind of more some practical issues. The kind of issues I've been asked frequently, even last week. Came up on Instagram. Somebody said, would it be okay for a couple to get married and to choose not to have kids? So can couples have a child-free, by choice marriage? Christopher.
Well, if from the Catholic perspective, if one right at the start of the marriage says we are not ever going to have children, that would invalidate the marriage.
Mm.
Because openness to children in the Catholic view is a prerequisite for the marriage commitment. The marriage commitment itself is the commitment that says, if it is God's will, let there be life. So put it this way, we can work at it in reverse. If a couple had a closed will to children right from the start of their marriage, and say they got divorced, and then they applied to the church, the Catholic Church, for a declaration of nullity. This is opening another can of worms and a difference in Catholic and Protestant understanding. But in the Catholic view, a declaration of nullity, it's not a Catholic version of divorce. It's a recognition by the church that, contrary to what appeared, this couple was never validly married from the start. And if they had an intention against children from the start, that's an immediate grounds for a declaration of nullity in the view of the Catholic Church.
Wow. Okay. Scott, go ahead. Jump in.
Well, I'm not persuaded that the Scripture speaks directly to this at any specific point that we can cite chapter and verse on. But I want to take an analogy from singleness that I think fits. Although I want to be very careful with the application of this. I do think there's a valid calling that the New Testament recognizes for singleness. I think Paul outlines that in 1 Corinthians 7, toward the last half of that chapter. And I think there's the reasons he gives. I think one of them is circumstantial, but two of them I think are much more principled. He says, because of the present distress, it's better for someone to remain as they are, and whether single or married, regardless. And I think what he's suggesting here is because of the current context of persecution that existed in first century Corinth, where he was writing, that it is more prudent for a single person to remain single. And the reason for that is because marriage and children, especially children, increase a person's vulnerability to persecution. And, if you think about it, this is a little artificial to think about. My wife works for Open Doors that serves the persecuted church all over the world. And so anytime anybody speaks about persecution in the U.S., I'd say, go get a passport and travel to another part of the world. So this is a bit of an artificial discussion, but I mean, I can envision if the day came where I was persecuted for my faith, I'd like to think that I could withstand virtually any persecution and not give up my testimony. But if you involve my wife and children in that, honestly, all bets are off. And I can't predict what I would do. If somebody was persecuting my children on account of my faith, I honestly, I don't know what I would do with that. What I do know is that my vulnerability to persecution increases exponentially once a wife and children are involved. Second reason he gives is that that marriage is not eternal, that it has an end point, and then the third point is that marriage enables someone to live for the kingdom in a way undistracted by domestic life. I think that the last two of those I think are just as applicable today as they were in the first century. Now we can debate that the text on that, but it seems to me that there is a valid calling for singleness. In some cases that's temporary, in others it's more permanent. Um, which again is one of the reasons why I think most Protestants would take the position that marriage is not a sacrament per se, um, but I say by extension, if someone can have really good kingdom reasons for remaining single, and I think by extension you can have good kingdom reasons for remaining childless. Now I'd want to be really careful to outline what's meant by those kingdom reasons, because I think they are very rare exceptions and not the rule. I think the general rule, I would suggest Christopher is right about that the expectation of Scripture is that if you are married, you will have children. I think where we differ is in the possibility of there being exceptions to that. And I want to emphasize that I think they are rare exceptions, but I think they are the legitimate ones.
Let me add to that. I don't know that we really differ, because the church certainly recognizes that the Catholic Church recognizes that there are circumstances in a married life where it would not be wise to bring a child into being, right? But what the Catholic Church would say, if there is a definitive will against children from the start, that definitive will against children would invalidate the marriage. Not a circumstance that came up which would make it imprudent to bring a child into the world, but a definitive will against children. For example, a couple that this would be an example of a definitive will against. The man, before the marriage even takes place, gets a vasectomy, or the woman gets her tubes tied. That is a definitive will against children. The definitive will is what would invalidate the marriage, not a circumstance that makes it imprudent to bring a child into the world.
Okay, so let me give you an example and see what you would say to this. I'm curious. Let's say that we have a couple who have a bit nobler intentions than the couple you just mentioned. Because I'd have a huge problem with somebody doing that. I'm not persuaded that would invalidate the marriage, but I would agree that that's probably something immoral to do. Now, it may be that the woman got a vasectomy or the woman got a tubal ligation because she has health issues that make it very dangerous for her to become pregnant. I think we both agree that that's within acceptable limits. But let's take.
I would not agree on that. Just to be clear.
Okay. All right. So here's the couple. They decide, they graduate from college, they get married, and are firmly convinced that God's called them to the mission field in a very dangerous part of the world. Let's say it be somewhere unnamed in the Middle East.
Yep.
And they decide, we feel like God's calling us here for the duration. Things could change. And I suspect if they came back to the States or came back to a safer place, they would certainly entertain having children. But at the start, they're headed to a very dangerous place, a place where I think Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7 would be applicable about the prudence of not bringing children into a family that's going to be at risk of, routine, regular, maybe even daily persecution for their faith. I think that could be a biblically justifiable decision. I don't think that would invalidate the marriage. I suspect you wouldn't either with that.
That would not be a definitive will against children, because as you yourself said, their circumstances could change and they would be more than open to bringing life into the world.
So let me just be clear. Can a definitive will against children be expressed in ways other than vasectomies or tubal ligations?
Yes, it could be. It could be, so for example, a refusal to engage in the marital embrace. Yeah, that could manifest a definitive will against children. And I know of some relationships where a declaration of nullity was granted because one or the other spouse refuse to engage in the marital embrace.
Okay.
Hmm.
I don't see most Protestant couples going down that road.
Yeah, there are not a lot of Catholic couples who go down that road either. There are some strange circumstances out there, strange
I'm not
situations.
surprised.
Ones.
Hey, let me ask this one, and then we'll move on to another topic. The way I've been asked is, what if a couple, like some friends of mine, said we're not going to have children because we want to use our resources to foster kids that are already here. So it seems to fit the theme of the nature of a marriage, but just not their own. What would you say to that, Christopher?
Again, are they manifesting a definitive will against having children? That couple might not be. So that would be, I can't, I would need more details. If they had, as a means of never having their own children, if they had rendered their sexual act sterile in a permanent way, yeah, that could invalidate the marriage. That would invalidate the marriage.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I think most Protestants would see that differently. That they would look at the prospect of fostering or adopting as heroic rescues.
Obvious. Well, let's not. I don't want to give the impression at all that the Catholic Church would
Yeah.
not see something beautiful and heroic in a desire to want to help children who are in need. Obviously, the Church would recognize that, but that would not justify rendering their own marriage sterile.
I think for most Protestants, it could. It could. Now, my guess is if they are, I think for most couples who are in that situation, Sean, that you described, the notion that they would actually be not open to having children of their own, I think would be very, very rare, if not non-existent. Because, somebody who wants to foster children, that's hard for me to envision that they would actually be completely closed off to having their own. I could see somebody maybe being closed off to having children for overpopulation reasons. If you were living in a part of the developing world, but other than that, that's a hard scenario, I think, to envision actually taking place. So at the end of the day, I think we're probably closer on this than it might seem at first glance.
I think I can put my finger on where the difference is, and I know we're going to get here, but eventually we're going to have to talk about the difference in Catholic and Protestant understanding about rendering the sexual act sterile. So
Yep.
I don't know if we want to bring that up now or later, but that we keep kind of dancing around it. That's what we're at.
Let's do it. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So if the union of a husband and a wife really and truly communicates the love of Christ in the church, then to render the sexual act sterile ourselves with an act of our own will, I am going to engage in that act, which God has designed for the generation of children, but I am going to act in a further way of my own will to render it sterile. This is to change the very symbolism of the act. And the Catholic Church sees this just as problematic and immoral as, suppose instead of baptizing with water, you decided to baptize with mud. You've now changed the symbol, right? In Catholic theology, the sacrament only communicates the mystery of Christ in the church in as much as the symbol truly symbolizes it. For example, the symbol of baptism is one of cleansing, right? If you were to baptize someone with mud, now the symbol is one of making dirty, right? It's a different symbol. The union of man and woman in one flesh, Paul tells us in Ephesians 5, verses 31 to 32, he says, this is a great mystery, a profound mystery. And I love the ring of the Greek, a mega mystery. This is a mega mystery. And it refers to Christ and the church. If that, and I like what the word you used, Scott. You said gravitas. And I think the Catholic and Protestant understanding here might just be different in its understanding of how gravitas is it, right? What degree of gravitas? Well, the Latin for this is a great mystery is this is a great sacramentum, right? This is a great sacrament. And it refers to Christ and the church. We take that as Catholics to the full extent. Like this really and truly is meant to communicate the way Christ loves the church. Paul said it just a few lines earlier. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Well, Christ loved in a way to give the bride life. It is unthinkable that Christ would go through the motions of loving his bride, the church, but render the act unable to give life. So again, we're back to an understanding of the integral nature of body and soul. In the end, only a ruptured view of body and soul, in my estimation, can justify rendering the sexual act sterile. If we have an integral view of body and soul, what we're doing to our genitals, we're also has spiritual ramifications. If we are rendering the act sterile physically, we're rendering the act sterile spiritually. If there really is an integrity of body and soul. I don't know how we can get around that. And so there are profound spiritual implications, profound anthropological implications, and profound ecclesiological and Christological implications if we start changing the matter of the sacrament. Rendering the genital act unable to generate is a changing of the very sacramental symbol.
Well, I think most Protestants would take not quite the same view of that. And let me put it this way: I've had long conversations with a number of my Catholic friends on this, and I have yet to hear a good response. And I'd be interested, Christopher, to hear how you respond to this, because I think most Protestants would hold that there is a God-ordained mechanism that does indeed render the marital act infertile, and it's menopause. And it seems to me
But let me pause right there. That's an act of God. Menopause is an act of God.
That's right. So
here's people say to me, I'll give you the space to finish what you're saying. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to clarify. We are not rendering the act sterile in menopause. God is choosing at this time there will be no more life. The issue that the Catholic Church has is only when we take that power into our own hands. If God chooses to render it infertile, then that's God's doing. God remains God. But we can't take that power into our own hands. That's the Catholic position.
Okay. In my view, that's a distinction without much of a difference. Because in my view, menopause it undercuts what I understand as Catholic teaching from the 1987 encyclical that insists that the unitive and procreative aspects of sex always have to go together.
Well, they cannot be artificially separated.
But I think menopause, I agree, menopause is I would call that a natural law, a separation of the unitive and procreative aspects of sex, which suggests that, that even to call that an openness to procreation during that period, I think is a little, I don't see where that makes a lot of sense. So I think as I read the New Testament, the unitive aspect of sexual relations often stands alone as a sufficient end in and of itself. And the procreative aspect certainly goes with it, because in the ancient world, there was only one way to procreate a child, which was through normal, natural sexual relations. So I think there's more entailments of this to come, but I don't think that most Protestants would hold that the unitive end of sexual relations can be a valid, legitimate end in and of itself, which means that there's some means of birth control, whether they be temporary or permanent, that are within the bounds of what the Bible's teaching.
Yeah, let me clarify Catholic teaching here, because you said the idea, you said, what was it you said, Scott? I was making a distinction without a difference in menopause and rendering the act sterile. Is
Right.
that how you said it? I just want to make
Right.
sure I'm
Yeah. Right.
quoting you.
That's right.
So let me clarify the Catholic position, and we need to be very careful on our terms here. What the Catholic Church is opposed to is contraception, right? The Catholic Church is not opposed to birth control because it's artificial. The Catholic Church is not opposed to birth control because we created something that did it. The Catholic Church is opposed to what is contraceptive. And contraception is the choice to engage in an act of intercourse, but then do something, again, the key line here is of your own will, to render it sterile. My wife and I have been married for 27 years. We have 5 children. It has only been God's will 5 times, to our knowledge, that our marital embrace result in a child. And I assure you, we've come together more than 5 times. Much to my children's surprise, we have. And this means it is not
thing. It's a good thing you gave your parental guidance warning on this at the beginning.
It is not always God's intention to bring a new life through intercourse, right? In fact, the very way God designed a woman's cycle is that she can only conceive within a short period of time, right? Sperm can stay alive up to 5 to 7 days, right? So I kind of comically comment, you may well have been conceived in the grocery store, right? Because your parents could have had intercourse a week earlier, and the sperm were kept alive for 5 to 7 days, and your mother might have been pushing the cart down the aisle in aisle 7 looking for Campbell's soup, and she might have conceived you right there. The point is this: for about 3 weeks out of every month of a woman's cycle, a woman is naturally infertile. Call that natural law, call that an act of God. God created a woman's body that way. And there is nothing wrong with understanding the way God created a woman's body and saying, okay, we have a good reason not to bring another child into the world right now. So we're not going to come together when you are naturally fertile. But now it's another time of the month. And we know, because of the way God designed a woman's body, that the woman is naturally infertile. Is there anything wrong with coming together then, knowing full well God does not intend to bring a new life into the picture? There's nothing wrong with a couple enjoying what God has made. But then the Protestant response is typically, and even among many Catholics, because many Catholics don't understand this teaching either. But people will say to me, and I've been teaching this for 30 years or more, oh, come on, Christopher. What is the big difference between sterilizing the act yourself and just waiting till it's naturally infertile, right? Both couples avoid children, the end result's the same thing. And I think that's what you're getting at, Scott, that many people see this as a distinction without a difference. Am I right? As you're saying that's a distinction without a difference?
Well, I think the Protestant view, I think, has a little bit more to it than that. And it's a response to the Catholic insistence that the unitive and procreative aspect, the one flesh aspect and the procreative aspect, always go together. And my understanding, I know where you're going with this. I'm going to correct it myself. And that is.
But let me clarify what you just said, just so people are clear, if I may.
I'd like to clarify what I just said first.
Go ahead.
I think what's often meant by that, as I understand Catholic circles, is that every time a couple engages in a marital embrace, there must be an openness to procreation. and that's all that means. Even in a clearly known infertile period, there must be an openness to procreation.
Which
Uh,
means, if I may clarify what that means, it means that you are placing whether or not a child comes into being entirely in God's hands, because that is the Lord and giver of life's prerogative and not ours. If we choose to engage in the marital act, we have to put it in God's hands whether a child comes into being or not. But you're not obligated to engage in the marital act. So if you have a good reason not to bring a child into the world, don't engage in the marital act when you're fertile. But if you choose to engage in the marital act, don't render it sterile, because now you're taking the powers of life into your own hands and you're playing God.
right. And I think what the Protestant view differs in the underlying assumption that the Catholic view makes, and that
Which
is
is
that the unitive and procreative aspects always have to go together. However you define that, they always have to go together in a way that that puts artificial contraception off the table. Right now, to be clear, I would hold that most artificial contraception also ought to be off the table. But the reason for that is because it's abortifacient, not because it's contraceptive per se. And so I think we would agree there that any method that either makes the womb inhospitable for implantation or actually
yes.
expels an implanted unborn child is off the table for someone who holds consistently to the sanctity of life that both Catholics and Protestants hold to.
Scott, are you aware
So
of the history behind this question? That you referred to the Protestant position, but it's really the Protestant position of the last 90 years.
I'm aware of
Uh,
that.
yeah, up until 1930, the Protestant position was the same as the Catholic position.
Right.
And I would just invite all the listeners to press into this question. Did the truth change in 1930? And were Christians wrong for 1,930 years about this question of contraception? And I think we need to judge the tree by its fruit. And it is impossible to understand the sexual chaos we are immersed in today and the gender confusion we are immersed in today. It is impossible to make sense out of it without recognizing the role that contraception has played in this chaos and confusion. The original gender confusion, I would argue, is rendering the genitals unable to generate. That's where we got off track here. That's where we started confusing the meaning of gender, and we threw the sexual act back on itself, meaning the goal is no longer marriage and family. The goal, when you legitimize contraception and say it's okay to separate the procreative and unitive aspects of your own will, the sexual act is thrown back as an act of pleasure. The goal becomes pleasure, and other human beings become a means to that pleasure. Rather than saying, I want to start a family with you, it becomes, hey, you're hot and I want sexual pleasure out of you. That's a very dangerous place to be. And I think it's time for Christians to look back at the history here and recognize the horrific consequences that have come when Christians themselves rejected 1,930 years of solid Christian teaching, not just Catholic teaching, but Luther and Calvin and all the reformers up until 1930 recognized the immorality of contraception. So I just think we should look at that history and ask, did the truth change in 1930? I
Well,
don't think it did.
well, I think the truth didn't change, but the application does change. The application has to be, has to take into account, not to justify them, of course, but it has to take into account new technologies, new things that come down the pike that we have to wrestle with.
Yes.
And we have lots of different measures of contraception that nobody for 1900 years had to deal with. And so you're right. The truth doesn't change, but the application of that does
Well,
change
here's the-
as
I mean,
circumstances change. So
arguing-
Hang on,
let me finish.
Christopher.
Let me finish. The reason for the chaos that you described, and that's indisputable, I would say is not primarily due to contraception. It's due to primarily the fact that marriage broke down as an institution, and there's so much now sexual activity that takes place outside of marriage. And
but why did that happen?
I understand.
That's
Part of
possible.
that
And
part,
without
part of that
contraception.
has to do with contraception, but you can't lay it all at contraception's feet, because that's part the whole agreement about marriage and procreation taking place within the confines of marriage. I think that's the solid biblical teaching. And I've heard Catholic theologians say that contraception, or that procreation was designed to take place within the general sphere of marriage, not so much within the general sphere of a specific act of sexual relations. So I don't think it's quite fair to put all of that on contraception, to where it's off the table for couples that are committed to each other, committed to the marriage. I think that's the horse of a bit of a different color.
Can I read something to you from 1930?
Sure.
I'd like to read, this is a report from, actually, this was an editorial published in the Washington Post soon after the Anglican Church accepted contraception in 1930. And then the Federal Council of Churches in America issued a report suggesting that it followed the Anglican acceptance of contraception. This was an editorial that was published in the Washington Post in 1930. It says, carried to its logical conclusions, the committee's report suggesting we embrace contraception in marriage, in effect, would sound the death knell of marriage as a holy institution by establishing degrading practices which would encourage indiscriminate immorality. The suggestion that the use of legalized contraceptives would be careful and restrained is preposterous. And what I want to get at here is something that people saw in 1930 that we've lost sight of today, because I would argue we are viewing the world through condom-colored glasses. And what we have lost sight of, here's how to summarize 1,930 years of uninterrupted Christian teaching on sex and marriage and the family. Marriage, sex, and babies go together, and in that order, right? Marriage, sex, babies go together, and in that order. As soon as you insert contraception into that paradigm, you'll eventually redefine all three of these, right? Babies will eventually become clumps of cells. Sex will eventually become orgasm exchange between consenting adults, and the sexual difference doesn't matter if it's with another man if you're a man, doesn't matter if it's with another woman if you're a woman, because as soon as you remove fertility from the sexual equation, there's nothing any longer to prevent two men from engaging in what might be a, quote, unitive act. And then eventually you redefine marriage to be a governmental stamp of approval on whatever kind of sexual pleasure exchange two human beings prefer. And this is the world we live in right now. And I'll just say it again, it is impossible to understand the world we live in now without the life-altering, sex-altering, marriage-altering ramifications of what rendering sex sterile has done to the way we see the world and the way we see men and women and the way we see the family and the way we see our body. Pope Paul VI, you mentioned this in 1968, just a small detail, that Paul VI wrote the encyclical reaffirming what has always been the authentic Christian teaching on this issue. And he said, if contraception becomes the order of the day, we will see an increase in immorality. We will see an increase in adultery. We will see an increase in divorce. We will see governments that trample on the rights of the family. And medicine and technology will eventually believe it has the right to do anything to alter the body in any way it sees fit. Again, we have to judge the tree by its fruit. There has just been rotten fruit that has come from this tree of contraception. And if I may go back to what I forgot to finish earlier about the difference without a distinction. You know, people will say, what's the difference between rendering it sterile and just waiting till it's naturally infertile? And I say, well, what's the difference between killing grandma and just waiting till she dies naturally? You know, in both situations, grandma's dead. True enough. But in one, we have an act of murder. And in the other, we have an act of God. And I firmly believe if you can understand the difference between euthanasia and natural death, you can understand the difference between contraception and respecting the natural God-given reality of when a woman is fertile and when she's naturally infertile. That's the Catholic position.
Scott, I'm going to have you jump in here and give a response on allow you some time to really flesh this out. And then we've got just a few practical questions at the end to get your somewhat quick responses to flesh out what this looks like. But Scott, go ahead and give your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think there's no denying that some of the impact of contraception on these other aspects that you described is real and true. But I think for the Protestant view of this is, for the person who's committed to following Christ, for the person who's committed to marriage and committed to procreation within the general sphere of marriage. And I would agree that I might put it a little bit differently, that marriage and sexual relations, procreation, and parenting are designed to be a seamless whole. But in the ancient world, in the world in which the scripture was written, in the world for most of the years in which our theology was written, there was only one way to procreate children. Right? We have other ways to do that today. We have other ways that involve artificial insemination, IVF. We can, that's maybe some of the short answers we're going to have to get to. But I think just the fact that sexual relations was the only way to procreate children doesn't mean that follows today, that's the only valid means to procreate children today.
Yeah, see, the Catholic Church
hold
just...
on.
Okay.
Hang on. Let me just allow him to flesh it out.
Yeah.
Sure.
And so if that's the case, if what's required biblically and theologically is that procreation take place within the general sphere of marriage, not required that it take place within the marital embrace per se, then I think you have some safeguards against some of the things that you're describing. Now, to be sure, for the culture at large, I think there's ample evidence of some of these destructive things that you describe. But I think if you put it within the context of the Christian couple who's committed to Scripture, committed to following Jesus, committed to procreating within the general sphere of marriage, which is what I think the Bible requires, then I don't think it's necessarily required that every act of procreation occur from a specific act of sexual relations. As long as it's within the general sphere of marriage, where that ensures that parents parent their own children. Okay? Now, exceptions to this, of course, are, when somebody's unfit, or adoption, which adoption in the Protestant view is not procreation at all. It's a heroic rescue that is just a whole different ballgame than that. So again, I think for Protestants, I think the fundamental question is, does the Bible allow for a separation, whether it's artificial or God-given, between the unitive and procreative aspects of sexual relations. If it does, then I think there are certain limited forms that are genuinely contraceptive that are acceptable. The methods that are genuinely abortifacient are not. Those are all off the table. And I think you can make a good argument that even the birth control pill is very problematic because it has a backup mechanism that's designed to prevent ovulation or prevent implantation. I don't think most birth control pills don't expel, an embryo from the womb. Those are, obviously way out of bounds and off the table. So I think that's the fundamental difference, I think, between our views is whether that separation between the unitive and procreative aspects of sexual relations within the sphere of marriage is an acceptable one biblically. I think it is, and I think, Christopher, you would argue that it's not.
Let me jump in here.
That's, I think, our fundamental difference.
I think
I think you've put it up.
Okay, perfect. Good. At least we have clarity on where we differ. That's awesome. Now, for some of these, just because you might say, peppered the beginning of our conversation to our audience that we would address these, I'd love to hear your kind of shorter, quick responses to each of these just for clarification and contrast.
Don't make academics give a Twitter response here.
No, you got this. I've seen you do it once or twice in the 25 years I've known you, Scott. So you got this. Dial in. We can do it. Let's talk about the issue of masturbation and assume it's a married couple. Is it ever permissible, Christopher?
You have to define what you mean.
So a couple, you could say a man with a woman or a woman with a man leading each other to, say, ejaculation apart from being physically the man inside the woman.
Yes. The Catholic position is the seed belongs in the garden. It belongs nowhere else.
That was a quick Twitter response. Got it. Scott?
Protestant view of that, I'm not sure there is a unified one on that. But I think I think most Protestants would not hold that every time two people in a married couple are intimate together, that intercourse has to take place.
Okay. Well, again, that's the Catholic Church would be similar there, but what we're talking about is orgasm. Orgasm needs to take place within the marital embrace. That's the Catholic position. But that doesn't mean a husband and wife couldn't be affectionate with one another without leading to orgasm.
Got it. Okay. That's fair. That's helpful.
Protestant view of that is that you can have orgasm without intercourse.
Okay. What about oral sex within a married couple? Yay, nay, permissible, not? What boundaries would the Catholic Church put on this, Christopher?
I think I already stated the Catholic position. The seed belongs in the garden, always. Should never be placed anywhere else. That does not mean all kinds of intimate tenderness and affection and kissing of each other's bodies couldn't be part of leading to intercourse. But one should never seek to substitute the act of intercourse for some other act. And it's the same principle. It's a contraceptive behavior. It's a contraceptive behavior. You're ejaculating, but not with any potential for life to come to be. So same principle holds.
Okay, that's helpful. Scott?
Protestant view of that, I think, would be that, especially in the case of menopause, that the fact that the seed doesn't go in the garden is virtually irrelevant.
Okay. What about the question of anal sex? Would you respond the same as oral sex, Christopher? It sounds like you have concerns.
Yeah, well, I have major concerns. Why would someone want to do that? What does it symbolize? What does it symbolize? And I think this is the question for all questions of sexual morality. Does this behavior truly symbolize the way Christ loves the church, or does it not? If it does not, it can't possibly be within the purview of love one another as I have loved you. It's unthinkable that that could really symbolize a loving act that somehow mirrors Christ in the church. If that's acceptable between a man and a woman, then it's acceptable between two men. So
I'd say oral sex, anal sex are both off the table.
Wait, so okay, clarify that, Scott.
I
For
would
a
say
married
both of
couple,
those. For a married couple, yeah.
okay. And what
Because
would
that's,
just
I think that's different. Because there's
that's
no, I mean, I think
contradict
with,
a moment
no,
ago,
not
Scott.
really. Well,
Confused.
because what I'm thinking about is a couple that, after menopause, intercourse may no longer be possible for them without extreme discomfort or pain from the woman. And that way, I think sort of mutual leading to orgasm, I think, is fine. Um, I think oral sex, anal sex, I think they're just of a different category, uh, and I think there, I think you can have a loving embrace with a married couple that leads to orgasm, but without what I would say inferior substitute for intercourse. Um, it may be that mutual masturbation is all that a couple can achieve if normal intercourse is not possible after menopause.
okay. Fair enough. What about the question that I've been asked a few times for married couples when it comes to certain sex manuals? Is it okay to get books, sex manuals about positions, to spice up your marriage? People will often say, would that be permissible within boundaries within the Catholic Church, or would you have caution about that, Christopher?
My caution would be: are you modeling what's happening in the marriage bed after a pornographic culture?
Hmm.
There are plenty of books I have right on my own shelf here that talk about how a husband can love his wife more in the image of Christ in the church. That gets into some specific details, um, but that's different altogether from a book that would be bordering or crossing the border into the pornographic, and it would turn the marriage bed into something more akin to what's happening in a porn film than something that images Christ in the church. So
Hmm.
there is written material that can aid a married couple in learning to love one another intimately and beautifully. Are you going to find that typically in the secular culture being published by secular authors?
Hmm.
Very rarely would you find a
Hmm.
reverential, tasteful book in that regard. But
Hmm.
you can turn to some Christian authors who would have a more tasteful and sacred understanding of the marital act and could help couples to achieve a more reverential, holy experience. So it's not that written material in itself is off the table, but what is the manner of that written material, the content, the intent? Those would
Hmm.
be my question.
That's great. Scott.
Yeah, my concern with that is that it it's hitting at the wrong target because most sexual problems in marriage are not anatomical or physical; they're relational.
Agreed. Agreed.
And so I don't think if a couple's got a crummy relationship, all the manuals in the world is not going to help you. Um, and it's mostly relational problems that need to be addressed, and the sexual stuff follows after that. So I think that's barking up the wrong tree, and will largely be a waste of time. And I think the concern about not turning the marital bedroom into a pornographic film is probably a good call.
That's great. Super helpful to find some common ground on that last one. Why don't we do this? At the end, I'll give you just a couple minutes each. If there's anything you want to reemphasize, something we didn't cover today, something you feel like, oh, I left that out, want to make this point. Maybe just sum up where kind of your position is, what you want people to know. We'll go maybe 2-3 minutes each or so, and then we'll call it a conversation. Christopher, take it away, my friend.
Now, let me just start by apologizing both to Scott and to you, Sean, for a couple times I interrupted and wanted to make my point maybe a little too forcefully. It comes from a place of a deep,
Mm,
deep conviction that we are spinning our wheels in overcoming the sexual crisis that we are facing in the church and in the world if we don't go back to the root of the problem. And I am convinced that these problems came upon us when Christians themselves started embracing a secular view of sex. And we did that, I would argue, when we embraced contraception. Um, and I'm not trying to shove people's face in this, but the zeal in my desire to communicate these truths comes from a place of love for humanity, of love for Christ, of love for the church, and I think we've let a Trojan horse come into the city of God, if I can use that as a kind of pun, right? We've swallowed a pill of goods here, and I don't think 1,930 years of Christian teaching were wrong. I think we've been wrong for the last 90 years, and we've paid a high price for it. And I would just conclude with this, that this came up briefly about artificial reproduction, artificial insemination, IVF. The Catholic position is consistent. Sex and babies belong together. And contraception is the approach where I want to have the sex without the babies. Artificial insemination, in vitro fertilization is just the reverse of contraception. It's saying, I want to have the babies without the sex. And the Catholic Church is saying both are wrong, because sex and babies go together, and we must not separate what God has joined. If God chooses a time in a woman's cycle where she can't conceive, that's God's prerogative. But we cannot play God and separate what God has joined. God has joined sex and babies, and we must reverence that. Whatever it costs us, we must reverence that.
Christopher, thanks for coming on. Don't worry about it for half a second. Love your passion in your writing and in your speech. I hope you'll come back many times so we can have this conversation again. Keep speaking on what you believe, I know you will, with clarity, because at the end of the day, even if people differ on some important nuances, I think you state it well and draw it out. So I want to encourage people to check out your writings where you popularize, thank you for the clarification, A Theology of the Body by John Paul II, and your other writings, super clear, super helpful. Appreciate you coming on. Scott, your final thoughts.
Yeah, Christopher, no offense taken for your passion. And I think there's actually a lot that we have in common. We've tried to focus on the places where we're different. And I think fundamentally, I would say that the Protestant view is not a secular view of sex. It's a different theological understanding of the connection between the unitive and procreative aspects of sexual relations. And I think that is, in my view, the fundamental difference between us. And I don't believe that the Bible requires that the unitive and procreative aspects of sex always go together. And I think the Protestant view is consistent as well, that it allows for some contraception within the bounds of marriage. It also allows for some assisted reproduction to deal with infertility. So I don't think the Protestant view is inconsistent on that. But I think that's the fundamental difference between the two of us. And I think when the Bible describes sexual relationships, I don't think it's treated as a sacrament. I think it's treated as something that's very important. It's got a gravitas to it, like I mentioned before. It does symbolize the relationship between Christ and the church. I think that is primarily in the way that husbands are to love their wives. But I think the fundamental difference is that separation between the unitive and procreative aspects of sex.
Super helpful. Hey, appreciate both of you on so many levels. I enjoyed this. I learned a ton. Appreciate you taking the time. Those of you watching, make sure you follow Christopher West's work at the Theology of Body Institute. Atheist, Christian, Catholic, Protestant. It's going to make you think. It's thoughtful and it's timely. Scott Ray has a bunch of books, including probably his magnum opus, Moral Choices, where he walks through this issue and many others. And of course, you can think about joining Scott and me at Talbot School of Theology to study apologetics or philosophy. We have full distance programs, top rated, both of them. We'd love to have you join us. Make sure you hit subscribe on this channel. We've got some other conversations coming up on topics such as the Exodus. We have a debate of a 13th century and a 15th century scholar who are both Christians who differ over this. Really a substantive conversation and a range of other topics you're not going to want to miss. If you enjoyed this, we hope you'll think about sharing it with a friend. Again, gentlemen, thanks for a spicy but interesting and also grace-filled conversation.
Yeah.
You're so
My
welcome.
pleasure. Good to be with you, Christopher. All the best
Thank
to you.